Okay, that's great. Okay, well, I'd really like to welcome David Ventura to speak today then, who is an ex-PhD student of mine and Nathan's, who studied here at Royal Holloway and did an excellent thesis on temporal ethics, looking at Bergson and Levinas and Gilles Deleuze. But today he's going to talk about decolonial futures, Glissant and Fanon on departing from the colonial past. Okay, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Henry, and thank you also for inviting me. It's great to be here and to see some familiar faces again. I look forward to our discussion in a bit. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is what I will be referring to throughout as the decolonial approach to the future of two thinkers who have in recent decades come to assume quite a central place in debates on colonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonisation, Frantz Fanon and Édouard Glissant. And what I mean by Fanon and Glissant's approach to the future is basically their practical suggestions or recommendations for how we can move beyond the dehumanizing condition of coloniality into a more humanized decolonial future. And I'll also explain what I mean by those two terms in due course. Now, I want to focus on these two thinkers today, not simply because of their place in current debates, but also because it seems to me that while in some ways they each develop quite a similar diagnostic analysis of the condition of coloniality, they also differ in quite crucial ways on their answer to this question of how we can move beyond that condition. And today I want to start to introduce some of these points by providing a very brief account of Glissant's and Fanon's life and ideas. And the first point to note is that Glissant and Fanon were both born in the French colony of Martinique in the 1920s. Fanon was born in July 1925 and Glissant 3 years later in 1928. And like many young Martinicans around this time, in the 1940s, Fanon and Glissant also both moved to mainland France to study, Fanon going to study psychiatry in Lyon, and Glissant philosophy and ethnography in Paris. And as readers of Fanon in particular will know, this migration wasn't insignificant from the point of view of their ideas, and that's because it was partly through this experience that Fanon and Glissant began to reflect on the forms of racist and colonial relationality that underpinned the French colonial empire. This migration to mainland France also allowed them to come into quite close contact with some of the key figures in the Western philosophical tradition, among them phenomenologists like Sartre, de Beauvoir, Jean Val, Merleau-Ponty, and even post-phenomenologists like Deleuze and Guattari and Derrida. And it was partly, but of course not exclusively, on the basis of this exchange with the phenomenological tradition that both Glissant and Fanon came to develop a conception of colonialism or coloniality that explicitly focuses on its effects for the lived experience of both colonized and colonizing subjects. For both, as will become clear throughout my paper, the colonial situation doesn't refer exclusively to a set of formal political institutions, although it also refers to those, and although Fanon and Glissant were both involved throughout their lives in concrete practical struggles to dismantle those types of institutions, for both, the notion of coloniality also refers to a more diffuse and pervasive set of power relations that harmfully structure even our ways of knowing, living, and inhabiting the world. Indeed, as we'll see, for both thinkers, this set of colonial relations affects and distorts even some of the most fundamental aspects of lived human experience, including even our way of experiencing space and time themselves. Now, as you might expect from this definition of coloniality, Glissant and Fanon also share the view that we cannot de-link our lives from the structures and effects of colonialism simply by abolishing this or that set of political institutions. Indeed, for both, if coloniality harmfully structures even our epistemic capacities and our lived experiences of space and time, then the practice of decolonisation must necessarily refer not only to political institutions, but also to the creation of new conditions and new modes of human existence and perception. Indeed, as Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, the task of decolonisation requires no less than making a new start, developing a new way of thinking, and endeavouring to create a new man. Now, in my view, while Fanon and Glissant are in broad agreement about these aims of decolonisation, it's on the question of how that decolonisation can and should be achieved that they begin to substantially differ. While both agree that decolonisation requires the creation of new forms of sensibility and even the creation of new rhythms and new ways of experiencing time, they also differ quite markedly on the question of what role a creative engagement with history or with the past should play in that process. And as you'll have guessed from the title of my talk, it's precisely this difference on what role history should play in the creation of decolonial futures that I want to explore today. Before I articulate this in more precise terms, however, I want to start by providing a very brief account of Fanon and Glissant's respective diagnosis of the problem of coloniality. And I want to focus particularly on their views on what effects coloniality has on the lived experience of time of colonized subjects. Now I'll start with Fanon. Now, Fanon introduces his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, with the claim that white civilization and European culture have imposed an existential deviation on the black man. And simply put, what he means by this is that the structures and relations of coloniality have had a profound impact on our ways of living and inhabiting the world. His most famous example for this, and one which I'll mention only in passing for now, concerns the extent to which those power relations come to be lived as a property of one's body. In a traditional phenomenological account, of course, the way that I live my body can be explained in terms of what Merleau-Ponty calls a body schema. That is, in terms of the implicit knowledge I have of my movements and postures in the world, and of the possibilities for action that I associate with those. Now, one of Fanon's points in Black Skin, White Masks is that this traditional account actually misses something quite crucial about the bodily experience of racialized or colonized subjects living under a situation of coloniality. And what it misses is that for those subjects, there isn't only a body schema, but also what Fanon calls a historical racial schema, whereby the racialized subject also feels their body and its possibilities for action as determined by the racist legends, anecdotes, stories, and history that are projected onto them by the white colonizing gaze. Now, obviously, to speak of the body and of the way in which our body inhabits the world is already in some sense to refer to the realm of spatiality. But in fact, Fanon isn't only interested in the distorted or alienated sense of spatiality that colonialism produces. Throughout his work, he's also attentive to the way in which human beings inhabit time, and more specifically, to the ways in which structures of coloniality harmfully distort and reconfigure the lived experience of time of colonized and racialized subjects. Indeed, as he writes in the opening pages of Black Skin, White Masks, the structure of the present work is grounded in temporality. Every human problem cries out to be considered on the basis of time, the ideal being that the present always serves to build the future. So, as we can see, the task of diagnosing on the basis of time how processes of colonization affect lived experience will be vitally important for Fanon. And as we can also glimpse from that very last phrase, this diagnostic analysis of how lived experiences of time are shaped by colonialism is also going to set the scene for Fanon's more prescriptive recommendations for how we should build a different, more decolonized future. But of course, you'll notice that there's at least one term missing there's one term that we normally associate with time missing from that last phrase. And that term is, of course, the past. Now, my suggestion is that this isn't accidental. And it's not accidental because it's precisely an erasure or closure of the past that Fanon sees colonialism as producing in the lived experience of time of colonized peoples. As he writes in Wretched of the Earth, perhaps it has not been sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not content merely to impose its law on the colonized countries present and future. Colonialism is not satisfied with snaring the people in its net or of draining the colonized brain of any form of substance. With a kind of perverted logic, it turns its attention to the past of the colonized people and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. Fanon's point, in other words, is that colonialism doesn't simply affect the way in which we experience our bodies in space. It also works to inscribe on the world a distorted and disfigured conception of temporality, which frames colonized peoples as having no history, or, at best, as having only a backward history that is inferior to the presumed superiority or modernity of Western European history and its traditions. Now, it's important to note that when Fanon speaks of this distortion and disfiguration of the past, he's not simply referring to the representations of time that are produced by colonialism. The problem is not simply that colonial structures produce bad or inaccurate ideas of time, but rather that these ideas actually come to be felt or lived by colonized subjects as over-determining features of their existence. As Ali El-Saji has recently described it, what Fanon is referring to here is the process by which colonized subjects are effectively tethered to a past of stereotyped remnants, isolated fragments, and violent distortions extrapolated back from one's alienated and stagnant state under colonialism. Now, if we keep these considerations in mind, we can start to see why, as I mentioned at the outset, Fanon describes decolonization as requiring the creation of new rhythms and new ways of experiencing time. What we can also start to glimpse is why, when Fanon says that every human problem deserves to be considered from the perspective of time, he's careful not to include the past as part of that solution, as part of the solution. That is, as part of that key phrase where he states that the ideal is that the present always serves to build the future. For if the past has repeatedly been defiled or distorted by colonialism, then we obviously need to be cautious with how we use or deploy the past or history in order to build another future. But of course, then the question becomes, how should we, according to Fanon, go about creating those new decolonized rhythms and senses of time? And to what extent is an engagement with history, with this past that the West has continually attempted to erase and disfigure, a vital or constitutive part of what Fanon sees as the praxis of decolonization? Famously, at the outset of Wretched of the Earth, Fanon describes decolonization as quite simply the substitution of one species of mankind by another. Decolonization, he continues, infuses a new rhythm specific to a new generation of men with a new language and a new humanity. Decolonization is truly the creation of new men. Now, while these claims already tell us quite a lot about Fanon's answer to the question I just posed, I actually want to start to explicate that a bit more by staying with black skin, white masks for a bit longer, and by focusing particularly on its conclusion. Now, Fanon starts the conclusion to that work with a quote from Marx's 18th Brumaire. And I want to start with that quote, not only because it tells us quite a lot about Fanon's approach to the future, but also because it resonates in some ways with Glissant's views on these topics, as we'll see later on. The Marx quote reads, "The social revolution cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped itself of all its superstitions concerning the past. Earlier revolutions relied on memories out of world history in order to drug themselves against their own content. In order to find their own content, the revolutions of the 19th century have to let the dead bury the dead." Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this quote. What's interesting to me is that it's precisely in this spirit that Fanon will go on to describe the task of revolution, or decolonisation, in the rest of the conclusion to his book. And he starts by noting that if we want to make a genuinely radical intervention against a system that is based on the exploitation of one race by another, then it should never occur to us to ask those people who are most harmfully affected by that system to start by rethinking their conception of history. And one of the reasons for that is that in terms of the urgency of the colonial situation, that is, in terms of the living death that this situation imposes on certain human groups, this rethinking or engagement with history would actually change very little. As Fanon exemplifies, and I quote, "The discovery that a black civilization existed in the 15th century does not earn me a certificate of humanity," end quote. Perhaps even more crucially, Fanon says that to equate the colonial revolution with the turn to history is to miss the extent to which that revolution must always be a genuine process of novelty and rupture. He writes, and I think it's worth quoting him at some length here, and I hope you can see this. "I find myself one day in the world, and I acknowledge one right for myself, the right to demand human behavior from the other, and one duty, the duty never to let my decisions renounce my freedom. But I am not a prisoner of history. I must not look for the meaning of my destiny in that direction. I must constantly remind myself that the real leap consists of introducing invention into life. In the world I am heading for, I am endlessly creating myself. And I show solidarity with humanity, provided I can go one step further. I am a black man, and tons of chains, schools of lashes, and rivers of spit stream over my shoulders. But I have not the right to put down roots. I have not the right to admit the slightest patch of being into my existence. I have not the right to become mired by the determinations of the past. I am not a slave to the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. And there should be no attempt to fixate man, since it is his destiny to be unleashed. The density of history determines none of my acts. I am my own foundation. And it is by going beyond the historical and instrumental given that I initiate my cycle of freedom." Now, Fanon is evidently making quite a few bold claims here, and I think we need to be a bit careful when we read these. But one thing that he does seem to be saying quite clearly, I think, is that as invention, decolonisation must necessarily involve a sort of leap beyond our historical conditions, or beyond what we might call our historical facticity. Indeed, as David Marriott has recently summarized it, the point of these passages is that invention, so often invoked as something historical, is here the figure for a kind of radical untimeliness that entails a leap, and this leap cannot be anticipated, nor can it be prepared for, nor can it be traced back to a prior historical moment to be interrogated as such. But as I said, we need to be cautious when we read these passages. And I think it's important to note that one thing Fanon is not saying, neither here nor elsewhere in his writings, is that we have nothing at all to gain from looking at history. Obviously, it would never occur to us to say, on the basis of that Marx quote, that Marx has no interest in history. And I think the same applies to Fanon, and we only have to look at The Wretched of the Earth and its extensive historical analysis of the trials and tribulations of revolutionary movements to see that Fanon is indeed interested in history. And clearly, he thinks that an engagement with history can play a vital instructive role in helping us to understand how we've arrived at where we are today, and how we can avoid repeating some of the mistakes of the past. So there is decidedly a place for historical analysis in Fanon. But of course, the real practical question in these passages is quite different. And what's in question here, as I've been saying, is the extent to which we need history to create the future. And I think it's here that Fanon starts to turn away from history, as it were. In other words, if he agrees that a certain history has created our present condition, and that we have something to gain from understanding that historical process, he also thinks that the creation of our future condition should in a way depend or rely on history for its inspiration and direction. Indeed, as Glissant himself comments of Fanon, decolonisation here means not only to act, but also to take full responsibility for a complete break. And it's exactly in this kind of way that I'm reading passages such as, I am not a prisoner of history, I must not look for the meaning of my destiny in that direction, I must constantly remind myself that the real leap consists of introducing invention to life, and so on. All these passages that I've highlighted here. The important point is that decolonisation requires a leap. But again, caution is required. And the second point to bear in mind when we read these claims on history and their repeated references to a black past or black history is that Fanon is here engaged in a critical conversation with the negritude tradition, and particularly, I think, with the work of Aimé Césaire, who was, of course, his mentor. Now, Césaire himself defines this concept of negritude as the recognition that there is a fundamental black being which has been covered over by the history of colonization, and which black people can and should return to. As he says in an interview, if someone asks me what my conception of negritude is, I answer above all that it is a concrete coming to consciousness of what we are, that is, of the very first factor of our lives. That we are black, that we were black, and have a history that contains certain cultural elements of great value. Now, Fanon expresses a number of serious reservations about this position. As I've already hinted, he first of all thinks that this kind of return or rediscovery of a black past, though of some ethnographic interest, actually has very little to contribute to the current revolutionary demands of decolonisation. It bears repeating that for Fanon, discovering that black civilizations existed in the past doesn't earn anyone a certificate of humanity. But Fanon also makes a second, more damning point against negritude. And this point is that this approach actually remains caught up in the very historical logic that it's allegedly trying to overcome. As he writes in Wretched of the Earth, the concept of negritude was the effective, if not logical, antithesis of that insult which the white man had leveled at the rest of humanity. Following the unconditional affirmation of European culture came the unconditional affirmation of African culture. But of course, as merely the opposite of a European affirmation of white culture, for Fanon, negritude remains caught up in the same logic that was developed and continues to be maintained by the forces of colonialism. And so Fanon continues, although this approach may take us to unusual heights in the sphere of poetry, at an existential, and I think here we can add revolutionary level, it has often proved a dead end. Now, without wanting to delve into the accuracy of Fanon's critique of negritude too much, I think it's clear that it's partly this critique which is shaping some of his own claims regarding the revolutionary or decolonial value of history. Indeed, I think it's partly this reading which leads him to repeatedly claim that the creation of a genuine decolonial future requires something other than a backward-looking engagement with history. To decolonize, as he says in Wretched of the Earth, is to create a kind of tabula rasa. And so for Fanon, it is no longer enough to reunite with the people in a past where they no longer exist. We must rather reunite with them in their recent countermove, which will suddenly call everything into question. For let there be no mistake, it is here, at this level of practical revolutionary activity, that people's souls are crystallized and their perception and respiration transfigured. That said, and given that much of this depends, I think at least in part, on Fanon's slightly polemical reading of negritude, I also think that we're justified in raising a couple of critical questions in response to Fanon's own approach to the future. And the first of these questions concerns what we might call the direction of a decolonial engagement with history. So we can see in the second quote, Fanon tends to assume that in appealing to history, Fanon tends to assume that in appealing to history, the negritude writers are advising a kind of return or rediscovery of a past that no longer exists. But, and this is my first critical question and one to keep in mind as I go on, is a backward-looking direction the only direction that an appeal to history can take up in decolonial praxis? Or is there another way of engaging with history that isn't just a sort of looking back, as it were? Secondly, if Fanon here implicitly criticizes negritude for, in a sense, forgetting or missing out on the transformative energy that a contact with the people's activity can generate, what kind of forgettings and erasures might be at play in his own approach to the future, which, as we've just seen, emphasizes a radical rupture and leap away from history? Now, I want to start to address some of these questions by turning briefly to Julietta Singh's recent reading of Fanon in her book Unthinking Mastery, which came out, I think, in 2018. Like many other feminist readers of Fanon, Singh notes the masculinist tone of Fanon's politics. More so than many other readers, however, Singh also questions how Fanon's writings, despite explicitly disavowing the mastery that is practiced by colonial systems, nonetheless remains caught up, both conceptually and linguistically, in a framework of mastery. As she puts it, Fanon framed himself explicitly as master, one that had been crippled through the colonial relation. For him, decolonization was an act of reclaiming this lost, masterful humanity that had been stripped from him through the racist dehumanization of colonialism. Now, I think we can dispute aspects of Singh's reading of Fanon, and crucially, she's appealing here to a quote, which I think is actually a slight mistranslation. But moving on to that, I think Singh is basically right in saying that the language and narrative tone of many of Fanon's writings do betray a sort of implicit commitment to mastery. And I think we can get a sense of this even in Fanon's pronouncements on history, which of course I've just quoted, and particularly in his claims that there should be no attempt to attach humanity to the past because it's humanity's destiny to become unleashed. What emerges in these passages, I think, is this conception of a revolutionary or decolonial subject, which is, as it were, always fully in control of its future destiny. It's a subject for whom all necessary decolonial resources are already given in the present, and indeed given by its inner capacity for a form of present activity that is never determined by the exteriority of the past or of history. And what I find especially interesting in Singh's analysis is not only this idea that Fanon's language betrays a certain commitment to mastery, but also her claim that through this commitment, certain erasures and sacrifices are produced in Fanon's thinking. According to Singh, what's erased by this attachment to mastery are a number of critical resources and allyships which could actually benefit the broad aim of Fanon's politics. She writes, Fanon's reliance on mastery remains bound to dialectical thinking and produces within his thought a series of sacrificial figures, women, animals, the disabled, and outcast, for instance, that haunt his discourse as its remainders and have a critical resonance with the politics and practices of decolonisation in the present. And as you can tell in her analysis, Singh focuses on specific sacrificial figures in Fanon's thinking. But what interests me today and beyond Singh are the more general, disruptive and creative possibilities that might be lost in what I've been calling Fanon's approach to the future. As I asked earlier, what kind of forgettings or erasures might be at play in Fanon's approach to decolonisation, and especially as a result of his emphasis on a radical rupture or leap away from history. Now, it's precisely at this point that I want to bring in Glissant. And as I said at the start, Glissant is broadly in line with Fanon on many of these points. But he also disagrees on the precise role that history must play in processes of decolonisation. And I think that by comparing their differences, we can get an even clearer sense of what disruptive possibilities might be lost in Fanon's approach to the future. But before I go on to that, let me first say a few words about Glissant's own diagnostic of coloniality. Now, I think what's really striking here is that, like Fanon, Glissant says that to decolonize, we must not only invent different political systems, but also find a way to live not only another rhythm, but also another notion of time. And once again, like Fanon, Glissant ties this temporal injunction to what he calls the devastating lived social consequences that have been produced by the history of Western colonization. He writes, one of the most disturbing consequences of colonization could well be this notion of a single linear history, and therefore of power, which has been imposed on others by the West. In another essay, he explicates these consequences even further by outlining what he calls the tortured sense of the past, or the tortured geography, that Western colonization has imposed on the lived time of Caribbean peoples. He writes, the French Caribbean is the site of a history characterized by ruptures that began with a brutal dislocation, the slave trade. Our historical consciousness could not be deposited gradually and continuously like sediment, as it were, as happened with those peoples who have frequently produced a totalitarian philosophy of history. For instance, European peoples that came together in the context of shock, contraction, painful negation, and explosive forces. This dislocation of the continuum and the inability of collective consciousness to absorb it all characterize what I call a non-history. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that in describing the history of the Caribbean in these terms, Glissant too will end up saying that we must look for decolonial inspiration somewhere other than history, that we must draw our poetic energy, to go back to that Marx quote, not from the past, but from the future. But in fact, Glissant thinks that we actually have quite a lot to gain from engaging with history. And unlike Fanon, he doesn't think that we can overcome the devastating effects of coloniality simply by turning or leaping away from history. He does, however, make an important caveat here. And the caveat is that in any given historical situation, there are always two senses of history at play. On the one hand, there is what Glissant calls history as written with a capital H. And this history, as he explains, is a colonial totality that excludes other histories that do not fit into that of the West. But of course, what we can also see from this definition is that beyond or beneath history as written with a capital H, there's always a variety of other histories, plural, that are fundamentally different from the distorted and disfigured conception of the past that has traditionally been written by the West as history with a capital H. And so, for Glissant, when we think about devastating historical phenomena like the Middle Passage and plantation slavery, what we have to keep in mind is that there are always these alternative senses of history or histories that subsist beneath and alongside what has traditionally been written as history with a capital H. And what we must also recognize is that there are always important lessons to be drawn for the present from those histories, even if of course those histories tend to be quite patchy and often consist of little more than just a few vague and opaque traces. As Glissant puts this point in what is perhaps his most famous text, The Poetics of Relation, let us nonetheless consult these ruins and their uncertain evidence. They're extremely fragile monuments, they're frequently incomplete, obliterated, or ambiguous archives. You can already guess what we are to find, or to discover, that the plantation is one of the focal points for the development of present-day modes of relation. Within this mode of domination and oppression, of silent or profuse dehumanization, forms of humanity stubbornly persisted. In this outmoded spot, on the margins of every dynamic, the tendencies of our modernity begin to be detectable. Now, Glissant is making at least a couple of key points here. And the first of these points is one that hasn't always been recognized in more traditional accounts of transatlantic slavery. And it consists of this idea that the histories of slavery are not simply histories of colonial domination and oppression. In many ways, those histories are also histories of human resistance against those dehumanizing forms of colonial relationality. But it also seems to me that Glissant is going somewhat further than this when he speaks of the plantation as one of the focal points for the development of present-day modes of relation. And I think what he's saying here is that this historical experience can actually teach us something vital about our own current and future ways of relating to history. And to see what he means by this, I think we need to reflect a bit more closely on what that historical experience entailed, particularly for those who were violently and forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas as slaves. In a 1994 lecture, Glissant explains, Africans arrive stripped of everything, of every possibility, and even of their language. What happens to this migrant? He reconstructs, on the basis of traces, a language and forms of art that one could say are valid for everyone. The deported African has not had the opportunity of preserving his specific inheritance, but he has made something new on the basis of the only memories, that is to say, the only trace thoughts that he had left. He has created, on the one hand, the Creole languages, and, on the other, forms of art that are valid for everyone, such as the music of jazz. And although this new American does not sing African songs from 2 or 3 centuries ago, he re-establishes, through trace thought, art forms that he offers as valid for all peoples. Trace thought seems to me to be a new dimension that in the current state of the world, we must set in opposition to what I call the false universality of systematic thought. In other words, this historical experience for Glissant can actually teach us a way of engaging with history through its traces that is never simply a return, a repetition, or a rediscovery of a path that no longer exists. One does not follow a trace, as Glissant says elsewhere, to rejoin comfortable paths. Instead, he argues, this way of engaging with histories through their traces, and I quote, is an opaque way of experiencing oneself drifting towards the other, end quote. Said differently, it's a way of drifting or moving to what's different and new. It's the art of using historical traces to bring new outcomes into the world. Now, I think what Glissant crucially shows with this appeal to the histories of slavery is that an engagement with the past doesn't necessarily have to be the backward-looking activity that Fanon so strongly criticizes the negritude writers for. For Glissant, when histories are engaged through their traces, they can also contribute valuable new resources to present and future projects of decolonisation. Moreover, that way of engaging with histories can also open onto a variety of new temporalities that are not those of the West. Indeed, as Glissant says elsewhere, and I quote, trace thought promises an alliance that is far from systems, and it gives onto these diffracted times that human beings are today multiplying between themselves, end quote. And here, I think we get the first concrete sense of what's missed or lost in Fanon's claim that we must not look for the meaning of decolonisation in history. And what's missed is precisely this Glissantian recognition that an engagement with histories can actually provide valuable critical resources for the decolonial creation of new forms of sensibility and of future ways of relating to both others and the world. But of course, you might be wondering how this engagement with histories can be enacted in the present. If it's clear that active struggle is the medium for Fanonian decolonisation, what kind of activity can enact the creative trace thought that Glissant speaks of in these passages? Now, I think to start to answer this question, we have to remember that for Glissant, the investigation of histories is not the business of historians exclusively. Indeed, perhaps even more powerfully than traditional historical writing, it is art, and particularly literature, that can concretize this task of engaging with histories through their traces. Indeed, for Glissant, insofar as it can imagine the plural and fragmented histories that history with a capital H has excluded, literature can play a vital role in critiquing and decolonizing the oppressive temporalities of the West. As he explains with reference to the literary productions of the Americas, time in our poetry and novels does not produce the impressive harmony that Proust has, for instance, put together. Our poetic quest for the dimension of time will therefore be neither harmonious nor linear. Its advance will be marked by a polyphony of dramatic shocks between incongruous phenomena or episodes so disparate that no link can be discerned. And we realize that literature in these conditions cannot be an object of pleasure or reassurance, but one which seeks to dismantle the complex mechanism and the infinite forms of colonial oppression. So, for Glissant, it is partly through literature and its imaginative powers that we can enact what he calls trace thought, and thus to start to dismantle or decolonize the oppressive forms of relationality and temporality that have emerged as a result of the history of colonization. Now, it's vital to note at this point that this idea that literature can play a decolonial function is not something that Fanon disagrees with in principle. Though Fanon didn't write as many works of literature as Glissant did, he did write at least a couple of plays. Even more crucially for our purposes, in Wretched of the Earth, he also endorses this idea of a combat literature, which he says can not only inform a national decolonial consciousness, but can also give it shape and contours and open up new unlimited horizons. Intriguingly in passing, he also suggests that this kind of combat literature can provide the occasion for a productive engagement with the past. Shortly before he introduces this notion of a combat literature, he writes that when the colonized intellectual writing for his peoples uses the past, he must do so with the intention of opening up the future, of spurring them into action and fostering hope. But very quickly, he then clarifies what conditions must be met for this literary engagement with the past to be able to play this productive decolonial role. And here I think we get back to more familiar Fanonian ground. He adds, but in order to secure hope, in order to give it substance, he must take part in the action and commit himself body and soul to the national struggle. You can talk about anything you like, but when it comes to talking about that one thing in a man's life that involves opening up new horizons, enlightening your country and standing tall alongside your people, then muscle power is required. So, if in principle, Fanon admits the possibility that an engagement with the past can open up new horizons, for him, what concretizes that possibility and gives it actual substance is still very much the priority revolutionary activity in the present. It's as though, for Fanon, literature can start to play a revolutionary role only once the spark of revolution has been lit at the level of muscular political activity. As he says, and I quote, "It is only from this point onward that one can speak of a national or combat literature," end quote. But I think what Glissant suggests, by contrast, is that a poetic engagement with histories can itself be the spark or this power that Fanon speaks of as the precondition for a combat literature. Now, of course, Glissant will not speak of muscular power here, but of what he calls the imaginative powers of literature. As he declares in an interview, to move beyond the situation of coloniality, we need to be permanently engaged in the task of opening up everyone's imagination onto something else. And we will not change anything in the situation of the peoples of the world today unless we change that imagination. But of course, in saying this, Glissant isn't recommending that we engage in a sort of apolitical reverie that has no impact on the present. And that's because the imagination, as he clarifies in Caribbean Discourse, is also a way for us to confront time and to deny its linear structure. That is, to deny the oppressive structuring that has been imposed upon it by the West. Now, what's crucial here is that unlike Fanon, Glissant doesn't say that literature can play this confrontational role only once a muscle-led revolutionary spark has been lit. All that is required, as he clarifies, is that we struggle to reconstitute the past and be transported into fields of oblivion where we must, with difficulty and pain, put it all back together if we wish to make contact with ourselves and express ourselves. In that sense, not only can the trace relation that literature enacts play a powerful function in decolonizing the temporalities of the West, it can also do that, as it were, even before a concrete or muscular spark has been lit. And once again, it's precisely these opportunities, these colonial opportunities, that a literary engagement with histories can create even before a revolutionary spark has been lit, that I think are closed off by Fanon's absolute prioritization of activity in the present. And I said in passing just now that Glissant's engagement with the past is by no means an apolitical reverie. And I said that quite intentionally, because it's precisely this charge that has been leveled at Glissant and his later work particularly, which I've been citing throughout, by some recent political commentators, among them Peter Hallwood. Now, the readers of Deleuze, of course, recognize that name, and in fact, his critique is quite similar to the critique of Deleuze. And briefly stated, Hallwood says that in putting so much faith in these forms of aesthetic construction, Glissant actually starts to veer away from the more concrete forms of emancipatory politics that characterized his earlier thought. And of course, this isn't insignificant for my purposes today, because the question might arise that, in a sense, none of what Glissant is talking about here is really politics. Put differently, in speaking of this engagement with histories, we don't really seem to be talking about the concrete forms of political solidarity and allyship that are of course explicitly implied in Fanon's more action-oriented conception of decolonisation. Before closing, I want to quickly defend Glissant against this charge of apoliticism. And I want to start by noting that this critique seems to me to be premised on an abstract opposition between the aesthetic and the political, which, quite simply, I think is unsustainable. But crucially, what this critique also misses is that the aesthetic relation with histories that Glissant recommends can themselves be generative of the alternative forms of solidarity and allyship that such critiques equate with the political project of decolonisation. And to make this point, I want to quickly mention a very concrete political project that Glissant was involved in towards the end of his life, and that is the creation of a national centre for the commemoration of slavery and abolition, which he took a leading role in setting up in France in 2001. As well as presiding over the creation of this centre, in 2007, Glissant published a text titled Mémoires des esclavages, where he reflects on the concrete aims of the project. And here, he states that the project's main aim was to study transatlantic slavery through research and public activities, such that underexplored aspects of this phenomenon could be brought to light. Now, what's interesting is that, in line with his view that an engagement with histories can contribute novel resources to projects of decolonisation, Glissant states that these activities were not simply about lamenting the past, nor indeed about reclaiming abstract notions of humanity for those who experienced slavery. Instead, the centre's engagement with histories was about creating new transversal modes of relation that could modify the present and open onto a different future. As he writes, the National Centre has not been conceived of as a place for lamenting the past, but as a place buzzing with relation, as a place for exchanges of knowledge and solidarities between people, which are what are most lacking in the world today, at least in the relations between the sensibilities of different peoples. And I think here we get the final sense of what's missed in not only the recent critiques of Glissant that I've just mentioned, but also in Fanon's approach to the future. And what's missed is precisely this recognition that an engagement with histories can also be a generative way of supporting concrete social and political struggles. And a creative relation to histories can do that, not only by fostering these alternative solidarities and allyships that Glissant refers to in this quote, it can also do that by opening up the imagination of those involved onto something else, onto a novel and future-oriented reality that is in no way a simple reflection or repetition of the histories that one is in relation with. Once again, it bears repeating that for Glissant, a relation with histories is not only a way of experiencing oneself drifting towards the other, that is, a form of relation across difference, but it's also an alliance that gives on to a multiplicity of times. Said different, a relation with histories is also a form of political alliance with others that can help us together to confront those oppressive temporalities that have traditionally been written by the West as history with a capital H. And that is precisely why an engagement with histories must be one of the focal points for the development of what we might call present-day modes of decolonial relation. Okay, so I want to wrap up now. And I guess I just want to conclude by qualifying some of these critical claims that I've been directing, especially at Fanon. And I want to finish by saying that if I've raised several critical questions of Fanon today, in a certain sense, these remain open questions for me, and they're by no means intended as a rejection of Fanon's thinking. All I've wanted to say is that there are these potential erasures and missed opportunities in what I've called Fanon's approach to the future. But as I also tried to indicate, there are also these moments where Fanon almost seems to go the other way, the way of Glissant or of histories, which is to say that I don't think Fanon's approach to the future is beyond rehabilitation. And indeed, I think Glissant is someone who can help us to not only rehabilitate aspects of Fanon's approach to the future, he's also someone who can help us realize some of the opportunities that are missed by Fanon's revolutionary turn away from histories. But of course, what that realization looks like in practice is something that will always have to be redefined and rearticulated in terms of the places and situations within which we find ourselves. Indeed, as Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill or betray it in relative opacity. And ultimately, I think Fanon and Glissant are both thinkers who can still, in various and different ways, help us to navigate the urgency and opacity of our own colonial entanglements today. Thank you very much.